World War II is often remembered as a gargantuan clash of steel, a conflict defined by the thunder of 88mm cannons, the relentless drone of B-17 bombers, and the agonizing grit of the infantrymen. But beneath the surface of the territorial conquests and the political upheavals, a quieter, more insidious war was being waged. It was a war fought not just against nations, but against memory itself. As the Nazi war machine rolled across Europe, it wasn't just looking for oil, iron, or strategic ports. It was hunting for the soul of Western civilization. In the wake of the Wehrmacht's advance, a strange and terrifying void began to open. In Paris, the hallowed halls of the Louvre were stripped of their pride, leaving only dusty outlines on the wallpaper where masterpieces once hung. In Krakow, the Weizstoss altarpiece, a towering achievement of Gothic woodcarving, was dismantled and spirited away in the middle of the night. Vanishing masterpieces, paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Da Vinci weren't just being stolen, they were being erased from public view. The crated continent. Across occupied Europe, statues were ripped from their pedestals and crated in heavy timber, shipped eastward toward the heart of the Reich. The intellectual vacuum. Libraries containing the only surviving manuscripts of medieval philosophers were stripped bare, their contents categorized or destroyed based on their racial purity. By 1943, it became clear to the world that this wasn't the disorganized looting typical of invading armies throughout history. This wasn't a soldier pocketing a silver spoon or a general taking a trophy for his mantle. This was systematic, state-sponsored theft on a continental scale. The Nazis weren't just winning a war, they were rewriting the history of human achievement to serve a dark and narrow vision. At the center of this cultural vacuum was a single man with a failed artistic past and a megalomaniacal future, Adolf Hitler. Before he was a dictator, Hitler was a struggling painter in Vienna, twice rejected by the Academy of Fine Arts. That rejection didn't dampen his interest in art, it twisted it into an obsession. Hitler's grandest vision wasn't just a 1,000-year Reich, but the creation of the Führer Museum. Planned for his childhood hometown of Linz, Austria, it was intended to be the largest, most spectacular art gallery the world had ever seen, a super museum that would consolidate the finest creative output of the Aryan race. To fill this colossal monument to vanity, the Nazis established the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, a specialized task force dedicated to appropriating cultural property. The pillage of private lives. Thousands of Jewish families were stripped of their belongings before being sent to camps. For the Nazis, their art collections, often built over generations, were simply abandoned property to be inventoried and seized. National humiliation. National museums in occupied territories were forced to surrender their Germanic works under the guise of returning them to their rightful home. The train of treasures. Countless trains, guarded by the SS, crisscrossed the European rail network. Their cargo weren't soldiers or shells, but crates containing the Ghent altarpiece, the Bruges Madonna, and the works of the Dutch masters. As the tide of the war began to turn, these treasures disappeared into the shadows. They weren't in Berlin, they weren't in the hands of the public. They had been hidden in castles, tucked away in remote monasteries, and buried deep within the bowels of the earth. No one knew where the heritage of Europe ended up or if it would ever be seen again. In the early years of the conflict, Allied commanders had little time for the preservation of culture. Their maps were marked with troop movements, supply lines, and bombing grids. To a general whose men were being cut down on the beaches of Sicily or in the hedgerows of Normandy, a 14th-century fresco or a marble statue was a luxury the world could no longer afford. War was about destruction, preservation was for peacetime. However, as the Allied advance pushed deeper into Italy and toward the French border, reports began to filter back to Washington and London that painted a harrowing picture of cultural devastation. The ammunition depots. Soldiers found that medieval churches and ancient monasteries were being used by the retreating Germans as ammunition dumps. A single stray spark or a well-placed Allied shell wouldn't just kill enemy soldiers, it would vaporize 1,000 years of history. The casualties of combat. In the heat of battle, Renaissance sculptures were being used as rubble to fill tank ruts. Frescoes were being blasted by artillery because they happened to be in the same building as a sniper. The salt mine threat. Intelligence revealed that the Nazis had moved the bulk of their stolen art into deep salt mines and copper shafts. These weren't just storage facilities, they were rigged with explosives. The Nero Decree, Hitler's scorched earth policy, dictated that if Germany were to fall, everything of value should be destroyed. If the war ended in a final violent collapse of the Reich, the Allies realized they might win the peace only to find themselves in a world without a past. They were looking at a cultural year zero. It was this realization that led to an unprecedented decision. In 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt and General Dwight Eisenhower authorized the creation of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section. For the first time in the history of modern warfare, an army went into the field not just to destroy the enemy, but to save the culture of the very people they were fighting. This was the birth of the Monuments Men, a ragtag group of middle-aged museum curators, art historians, architects, and librarians who were about to trade their fountain pens for carbines and enter the most dangerous treasure hunt in history. The Allied High Command called them the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section. It was a dry, bureaucratic title for a unit that was nothing but conventional. In the grand machinery of the war, among the millions of young men trained to operate tanks, fire mortars, and jump from planes, this unit stood out like a relic from a different century. They were the Monuments Men. At its peak, the unit was composed of just a handful of men and women, fewer than 350 across all the Allied forces. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were museum curators from the Met, architects from London, art historians from Harvard, and professors of medieval literature. Most were middle-aged, out of shape, and possessed absolutely no combat experience. They were men of the gallery and the library, suddenly thrust into the cacophony of an active war zone. While the men around them carried M1 Garands and Thompson submachine guns, the Monuments Men carried notebooks instead of rifles. Their primary weapons were meticulous ledgers and journals used to document every fragment of stone and every scrap of canvas they encountered. Maps of cathedrals instead of enemy positions. They moved across Europe with overlays that highlighted 14th-century chapels, Renaissance libraries, and historic plazas, pleading with the advancing infantry to avoid these non-military targets. Flashlights and magnifying glasses, tools designed for the quiet study of brush strokes, now used to scan for booby traps in the dark corners of damp basements. Their mission was divided into 3 monumental phases: find the art, protect it, and return it. It was a mission of recovery and restitution that flew in the face of centuries of military history, where to the victor go the spoils had always been the rule. These men were there to ensure that for the first time in history, the victor would take nothing but the satisfaction of seeing culture returned to its rightful home. The reality of being a Monuments Man was far from the quiet scholarly life they had left behind. They lived in a state of constant high-stakes friction with the Allied combat divisions. As the Allied armies surged across France and Belgium, the Monuments Men followed just behind the advancing tanks, and in many cases they drifted into the no-man's land ahead of them. The pressure was immense. Every time an Allied battery opened fire on a German-held village, the Monuments Men felt the weight of history. The general's burden. They had to walk into the command tents of battle-hardened generals like George S. Patton, who were focused entirely on the destruction of the Third Reich, and convince them to alter their lines of fire. They had to argue that a specific medieval bridge or an ancient town square was worth more to the future than a tactical shortcut. Marking the heritage, they moved through smoking ruins, often while snipers still lurked in the rafters, to hang off-limits signs on historic sites. They acted as a shield between the art and the liberating soldiers, who often didn't realize that the crate they were using as a card table contained a priceless Rembrandt. Searching the rubble. In cities like Aachen and Caen, where the bombing had been absolute, the monuments men crawled through the pulverized remains of museums. They weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for the broken pieces of statues and the singed remnants of archives, trying to piece back together a civilization that was literally turning to dust. One mistake, one misread map, or one delay in reaching a site could mean a loss that no amount of money or time could ever undo. They were the thin line between a liberated Europe and a culturally bankrupt one. As the German interior finally collapsed in the spring of 1945, the full scale of the Nazi looting operation began to reveal itself. The art hadn't been destroyed in the bombing raids on Berlin. It hadn't been lost at sea. It had been systematically hidden away in a desperate attempt to protect Hitler's future Führer Museum and the private collections of high-ranking Nazis like Hermann Goering. The monuments men began to uncover a network of secret repositories that seemed more like something out of a Gothic thriller than a military report. They found the treasures of Europe stashed in salt mines, deep underground, where the humidity was constant and the depth provided a natural bunker against Allied bombs. In mines like Merkers and Altausee, they found literal mountains of gold bullion and rooms packed floor to ceiling with the finest art in existence. Castles in the Alps, remote fortresses like Neuschwanstein, which the Nazis had converted into massive processing centers for looted Jewish collections, and the treasures of the Louvre. Sealed tunnels, railway tunnels, and copper shafts that had been walled up with brick and rigged with explosives, designed to be the final resting place of European history if the Reich should fall. Inside these dark, damp chambers, the scholars turned soldiers found a hall that was staggering in its breadth. They found Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges wrapped in dirty mattresses. They discovered Vermeer's The Astronomer leaning against the walls of a salt mine. They found entire national collections from Poland, France, and the Netherlands, stacked like common air cargo. It was a race against the Nero Decree, Hitler's order to destroy everything rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Some of these sites were found just minutes before they were scheduled for demolition. In Altausee, local miners had risked their lives to intercept the marble crates, actually unexploded bombs, meant to collapse the mine. The monuments men had found the heart of the world's heritage. Now they faced the even greater task of waking it up and sending it home. By the spring of 1945, the Nazi regime was in its death throes, but the danger to the world's cultural heritage had reached its peak. In the Austrian Alps, near the village of Altausee, a sprawling labyrinth of salt mines held a secret that could have ended Western art history as we know it. The orders from the regional Nazi governor, Gauleiter August Eigruber, were as cold as the mountain air. If the Americans approach, destroy everything. To Eigruber, if the Third Reich could not possess the beauty of the world, then the world would have no beauty at all. This was the Nero Decree in its most literal and nihilistic form. Deep within the mine, among the thousands of crates of Vermeer, Rembrandt, and Michelangelo, the German engineers had already placed the instruments of annihilation. 8 massive wooden crates, each disguised with the label "Caution, Marble," were positioned at strategic structural points throughout the tunnels. Inside were not statues, but 500-pound unexploded aircraft bombs. The plan was simple and devastating: blow the support pillars, collapse the mountain, and bury the greatest achievements of human civilization under millions of tons of salt and rock forever. The Monuments Men were in a frantic race against the clock. Moving ahead of the main infantry lines, a small team of MFAA officers began a desperate game of high-stakes diplomacy. They negotiated with local Austrian miners who were terrified of losing their livelihood if the mine collapsed. They bribed mid-level officials with cigarettes and promises of leniency. They stalled, they lied, and they pressured the German guards to ignore the Gauleiter's frantic radio commands. On May 4, 1945, just days before the formal German surrender, the local miners and a few rebellious German soldiers took a stand. They secretly moved the bombs, blocked the entrances with smaller controlled blasts, and waited. When the American 80th Infantry Division finally arrived and the Monuments Men were able to break the seals, they entered a silent world of wonders. Inside, they found the Ghent altarpiece and the Bruges Madonna sitting in the dark, dusty and cold, but unharmed. Human history had come within hours of a catastrophic blackout, a loss that would have left the post-war world culturally hollow. As the guns fell silent across Europe, the Monuments Men realized that finding the treasure was merely the prologue to a much larger, much grueling task. The treasure hunt was over, the restitution had begun. The map of Europe was a jagged mosaic of displaced peoples and displaced property. The question that haunted the MFAA was simple, yet nearly impossible to answer. Who did it belong to? They established central collecting points, most notably in Munich and Wiesbaden. These were essentially the world's largest lost and found departments. Millions of objects, from the Monet paintings of the Rothschild family to the personal silver of a local baker, had to be inventoried and authenticated. Tracing the bloodlines. The Monuments Men became forensic historians. They pored over the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg ledgers, the Nazis' own meticulous records of their thefts, to trace works back across borders that had been redrawn by war. National restitution. They oversaw the massive logistical feat of returning entire national collections. Trains loaded with Dutch masters were sent to the Netherlands. The Weitstaas altarpiece was returned to a scarred and grieving Poland. Individual justice. Perhaps most emotionally taxing was the effort to help Jewish families reclaim stolen heirlooms. In many cases, the families were gone, and the art was the only surviving witness to a life that had been systematically erased. The work was slow, grueling, and often thankless. It took decades of legal battles and archival research to settle many of the claims. Even today, the work of the Monuments Men continues through their successors. Thousands of works are still listed as missing, and every few years a lost masterpiece surfaces in a private collection, beginning the cycle of restitution once again. In the grand tally of World War II, the Monuments Men are often relegated to a footnote. They didn't stop the Blitzkrieg, they didn't storm the beaches of Normandy, and they didn't win the decisive tank battles that broke the German army. In a war that claimed 60 million lives, the preservation of oil on canvas or chiseled marble can seem, at first glance, secondary. But the Monuments Men understood something profound that many in the heat of battle forgot. They were fighting for the memory of the human race. If the Nazis had succeeded in their cultural purge, they would have won the war regardless of the battlefield outcome. By erasing the art, literature, and history of their enemies, they would have successfully rewritten the narrative of humanity. The Monuments Men saved something just as fragile and just as essential as human life, our shared cultural identity. In the aftermath of the most destructive conflict in history, these scholars in uniform proved a vital truth. Civilization isn't defined only by who survives the fire or who has the most powerful weapons. It is defined by what a society chooses to protect when everything else is burning. When we walk through the Louvre, the Met, or a quiet village church in Belgium today, we are walking through a gallery of ghosts, treasures that exist only because a handful of librarians and architects decided that some things were worth more than their own safety. They ensured that when the smoke finally cleared, the world would still remember who it was.